The war had ended, but no one marching along that dirt road believed it yet. The May sun poured down on their shoulders, a steady weight of heat and humiliation. They were Wehrmacht soldiers, once fed on visions of glory, now reduced to a column of silence. Boots scraped the chalky earth. Some men limped on rag-wrapped feet. Their rifles had been piled on the roadside days ago, and the clink of canteens against empty belts was the only sound besides the rasp of breath. Among them walked Franz Keller, 22, who had once sworn to fight to the last bullet. Now his hands were raised only to shield his eyes from the blinding sky. His uniform, once crisp field gray, was a ragged shade of dust. He had imagined surrender many times, but never like this. German radio had painted the Americans as ruthless, vengeful, eager to grind the defeated into the dirt. Rumors spread like fever. Prisoners shot in fields, shipped to salt mines, starved behind barbed wire. So when the column first glimpsed the U.S. trucks idling ahead, engines rumbling, a shiver passed down the line. A man near Franz muttered a prayer. Another spat into the dry road as if defying fate. But most kept their heads low, too tired to do anything but stumble forward. The Americans were young, too. Boys, really, lounging against their olive-green vehicles, cigarettes dangling from lips, steel helmets catching the sun. Their rifles were slung casually, not aimed. One GI, freckles scattered across his face like careless brush strokes, lifted a hand in a gesture that was neither welcome nor threat. Just a wave, as if the war had been a strange misunderstanding. Franz couldn't fathom it. He had imagined hatred. Instead, there was a kind of wary curiosity. They reached the trucks. Orders barked in English, brisk but not cruel, and the Germans were herded aboard. Wooden benches lined the truck beds, and the defeated soldiers sat stiffly, waiting for whatever punishment would come next. Franz stared at the American across from him, a dark-haired man with a square jaw who chewed gum as though the war were already a past annoyance. The man caught Franz's gaze, held it for a beat, then shrugged. A silent, almost comical gesture, like two farmhands stuck in the same rainstorm. It unsettled Franz more than any shouted insult might have. The ride lasted hours. Through gaps in the canvas, the Germans glimpsed a country they had been taught to hate, but had never seen. Green fields rolled out like carpets. Farmhouses with white porches stood intact, untouched by bombs. Children waved from driveways. No rubble, no burned-out skeletons of cities. Only abundance and ease. Some men whispered in disbelief. Others stared, hollow-eyed, too proud to acknowledge the shock. Night fell before they reached the first camp. Searchlights swept the perimeter fences, but the towers were manned by guards who looked almost bored. No dogs lunged at the wire, no whip cracks split the dark. The Germans shuffled through gates into an orderly world. Wooden barracks, gravel paths, electric lights humming overhead. At the registration table, an American clerk took their names, checked their papers, offered curt nods. Medical corpsmen inspected wounds with brisk professionalism. No slaps, no shouting, just efficiency. It felt unreal, as if they had wandered into a dream where defeat was clean and strangely civilized. Franz lay awake his first night on a thin mattress, staring at the ceiling beams. He felt stripped of everything: the Reich, the fight, even the certainty of enemy hatred. Around him, men breathed in slow, exhausted rhythm. Somewhere down the barrack, someone was quietly sobbing into a pillow. Franz thought of his mother in Hamburg, the bombings, the hunger. He wondered if kindness from the enemy was another trick, a softening before something worse. Yet sleep finally pulled him under, heavy as stone. Morning brought routine, roll call, rations, orientation. The breakfast startled them. Eggs, bread, coffee, hot and strong. Some men refused to eat at first, suspicious. Others devoured everything, hunger stronger than pride. Franz tasted the coffee and felt its warmth spread through his chest. He tried not to think about the bitter substitute brew back home. A sergeant explained camp rules in clipped, accented German. No one shouted. No one struck them. Work details would come later. For now, they were to rest, recover, and obey. By afternoon, Franz found himself leaning against the fence during a break, watching an American truck unload crates, labels stenciled in bold letters. Beer. The sight was so absurd he laughed, a short, dry sound that startled even him. Beer? Here? For prisoners? The thought was ridiculous. Back in Germany, beer had become scarce, almost mythical. Yet he watched as guards carried the crates into a canteen building just beyond the barracks. The scent wafted faintly when a door swung open. Yeasty, cold, unmistakable. Some prisoners murmured, pointing. A guard smirked and tapped one of the crates like a secret joke. That night, rumors buzzed through the barracks like summer insects. The Americans drank beer right across the yard. Some swore they had seen other prisoners, not guards, sipping mugs after work detail. No one believed it. It had to be a misunderstanding, some cruel tease. Franz kept silent, though the image clung to him. Cold glass, pale foam, an ordinary pleasure that felt impossibly distant from mud and surrender. Days blurred. The men worked clearing brush, repairing fences, stacking lumber. The labor was hard, but not savage. Breaks were given. Water plentiful. Guards spoke in a mix of English and broken German, sometimes joking, sometimes stern, but never brutal. And slowly, fear loosened its grip. Franz caught himself studying the Americans, how casually they carried their weapons, how easily they laughed. They were victors, yes, but not monsters. One sweltering afternoon, sweat plastering his shirt to his spine, Franz and his work detail were led back through camp gates. A sergeant shouted something in English. A German interpreter translated with a grin, "For the hard work, refreshments." The phrase puzzled them until they stepped into the canteen. It smelled of wood and cool air. And there, lined up on the counter like a mirage, were bottles. Brown glass beading with condensation. Ice clinked in buckets. The Americans were handing them out one by one. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then someone, an older soldier with sun-cracked lips, stepped forward, took a bottle in trembling hands. The guard popped the cap with a swift motion and nodded. The German raised it, hesitated, then drank. Foam traced his mustache. His eyes widened. He laughed. A sudden, startled laugh that turned heads. Others followed, shy at first, then eager. Caps flew, glass clinked. The room filled with a low murmur of disbelief, relief, even joy. Franz took his bottle last, cool and sweating in his palm. He stared at it, at the foreign label, at the guard who waited without malice. Then he drank. The taste was light, crisp, astonishingly cold. It slid down his parched throat and pooled in his stomach like some forgotten memory of peace. For an instant, the war fell away. The propaganda, the fear, the rubble of home. Here was something human, shared across enemies. A small, absurd mercy. Franz lowered the bottle, still stunned. Around him, men smiled for the first time in months. Someone started humming a tune. An American laughed softly, shaking his head as if to say, "You're just men like us." Franz felt a shift then, quiet but undeniable. He was still a prisoner, still defeated. Yet something had cracked. The certainty of hatred, the armor of ideology. If the enemy could offer this, not pity, but simple respect, what else might be false about the world he'd been told to die for? Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the camp fences gold. The bottles clinked softly as men drank in silence, each lost in private reckoning. For the first time, Franz wondered what it might mean to begin again. If defeat could taste, unexpectedly, like cold beer. What he didn't know, As the last light faded, was that this small act wasn't accidental. Behind the fences of America, something deliberate was unfolding. A quiet campaign to break not bodies, but beliefs. And it was only just beginning. The camp was a world with its own slow rhythm, a place where time no longer followed the front's brutal tempo of attack and retreat. Mornings began with the whistle of a guard and the crunch of boots on gravel. Rows of barracks stirred to life as men pulled on coarse work shirts and caps, their gray uniforms, long since replaced by khaki overalls, stamped. With bold black PW, Franz rose each day with the same brief disorientation, the jolt of waking. Not to sirens or shell fire, but to birdsong drifting over the fence. It was safety, yet also a strange kind of exile. He was alive, but not free. At first, the days passed in cautious silence. The prisoners watched the Americans with wary eyes, measuring every gesture. But the guards seemed uninterested in vengeance. They checked roll, handed out breakfast, smoked, while leaning on rifles like farm tools. The camp kitchen smelled of bacon and bread. The meals, though plain, filled stomachs that had shrunk under wartime scarcity. Franz noticed how quickly suspicion lost to hunger. Even the proudest men ate heartily after a day or two, the fear of poison fading with each swallow of warm coffee. Work details soon began. Trucks carried groups of POWs into the surrounding countryside. Orchards, sawmills, canning factories. Franz was assigned to a farm where rows of corn stretched toward a horizon so wide it felt alien. The soil here was dark and rich, nothing like the rubble-churned earth he'd known in Germany. The American farmer who oversaw them was grizzled and watchful, but not cruel. He spoke little German, but his gestures were clear enough. Lift, stack, carry, rest when told. He paid them with camp scrip, thin paper bills redeemable at the canteen. It felt absurd to Franz. Paper money from a country he had fought, exchanged for candy bars and cigarettes. On the ride back each evening, the men sat quietly, dust coating their hair and skin. Sometimes an American guard would toss a joke to break the silence, a few words of halting German or a teasing remark about slow shovels. At first the prisoners stared back blankly, unsure how to respond. Over time a few dared to smile. Franz remained mostly reserved, but he listened to the sound of laughter, the easy banter that belonged to men who knew they were going home whole. Life inside the fence was not without shadows. The barracks held men of every stripe, hard-bitten Nazis still clinging to ideology, weary draftees who had long since stopped believing, and the quiet ones who said nothing at all. Arguments broke out about the war, about Hitler, about whether surrender was cowardice. A few diehards tried to intimidate the rest, hissing that fraternization was betrayal. Franz kept his distance from them. Something in him had shifted the day of the beer. He could no longer pretend the enemy was a monster. But neither could he yet say aloud that perhaps the war had been built on lies. The camp library opened one afternoon with little fanfare. Wooden shelves held donated books in English, and, surprisingly, some in German. Goethe, Schiller, even newspapers from neutral Switzerland. Franz watched as curious men drifted in, fingering pages like objects from another planet. He took a German translation of Mark Twain one day, more for the novelty than the story, but found himself laughing softly at the wry humor. It was unsettling and oddly comforting to laugh again, to discover that Americans told jokes about human foolishness just as Germans did. Sundays carried a peculiar quiet. No work trucks rolled out. Instead, the camp hummed with music. An orchestra, cobbled together from whatever instruments men had salvaged or been sent by families. Violins sang beneath the watchtowers. An accordion wheezed out folk songs. Soccer games sprang up on the open field, prisoners shouting in half a dozen dialects, while guards leaned on fences, some cheering good plays despite themselves. Franz, who had played midfield as a boy, joined reluctantly one week and found his legs remembering how to run with joy instead of fear. For 90 minutes, the war seemed to vanish. Yet the sense of limbo remained. Letters trickled in from home, news of bombed cities, hunger, missing brothers. Franz received a single postcard from his mother, its edges smudged, her words brittle with worry, but alive. He read it until the paper frayed. Each sentence was a lifeline and a wound. How could he explain this strange captivity? Safe, even kind, while his family starved. Shame gnawed at him in quiet hours. The beer, meanwhile, was no longer rumor. It appeared at the canteen in measured quantities, usually on Saturdays after long work weeks. Not free, one had to trade scrip earned by labor, but available. The first time Franz bought one himself, the act felt surreal, as if stepping out of a war film into an American postcard. He stood with a small group of men, bottles sweating in the heat, and for a moment they were just laborers at the end of a shift. The guards nearby hardly watched. The taste was still astonishing, cold, crisp, a reminder of summer evenings before the world burned. Someone raised a toast, not to Hitler, not to Germany, just zum Leben, to life. Quiet laughter followed, tentative but real. What unsettled Franz most was not the comfort, but what it revealed. The Americans didn't seem to need hatred to win. Their power felt casual, unforced. They fed their prisoners well, gave them work, even small pleasures. It was discipline without cruelty, victory without humiliation, and that chipped away at everything he'd been taught. If the Reich had called these men brutes, yet here they were handing out ice water and fair pay, what else had been lies? The realization was like a slow thaw, painful and liberating. One evening, as cicadas buzzed beyond the fence, Franz sat with Dieter, an older soldier who had once been an ardent Nazi. Dieter smoked in brooding silence before muttering, "They treat us better than we treated our own conscripts." He said it like a confession, eyes fixed on the dirt. Franz didn't answer, but the words stayed with him. In the distance, the camp orchestra struck up a waltz, notes drifting into the warm night. It was hard to hate while listening to music. Not everyone softened. Some prisoners clung tighter to ideology, whispering that kindness was manipulation. Others feared what this new vision of the enemy might mean for their own guilt. Fistfights broke out occasionally. The guards intervened without brutality but with firm swiftness. Franz kept his head down but watched, feeling the fault lines shift. Something larger than survival was happening here. A quiet war of ideas, waged not with bullets, but with decency. The Americans seemed to understand this in their own way. They encouraged classes, English lessons, basic civics, even film nights showing American newsreels and comedies. Some were propaganda, yes, but also windows into a life unconcerned with conquest. Franz sat through one showing of a Chaplin film, laughter rippling through the barrack. He realized with a jolt how strange it was to laugh alongside his captors, sharing humor that made them all briefly human. Work expanded with the seasons. By autumn, Franz was helping harvest cotton, his hands raw but his belly full. He earned enough scrip to buy small luxuries, a bar of soap scented faintly of pine, a tin of biscuits. Each purchase chipped away at the enemy image he'd once carried. He was still a captive, yet he felt more like a man again, not a pawn. Still, nights brought reflection. Under the Texas stars, lying on his narrow bunk, Franz would remember cities in ruins and friends dead for a cause that now felt paper-thin. He thought of the beer, of laughter shared with men in foreign uniforms, and wondered what he might say to his mother if he ever returned. How do you explain that defeat can be gentle? That the enemy's kindness wounds more deeply than their bullets? One chilly evening, as the wind rustled the camp's tall wire, an American officer visited their barrack. He spoke fluent German and smiled without arrogance. "Tomorrow," he announced, "a new education program begins. You'll learn about democracy, how our system works. Participation is voluntary, but encouraged." Murmurs swept the room. Some scoffed, others looked intrigued. Franz felt his chest tighten. It was clear now. This was no accident. The comfort, the respect, even the beer. All threads in something deliberate. He lay awake long after lights out, staring into darkness, hearing faint laughter from another barrack. Whatever was happening here went beyond survival. The war of guns had ended, but another contest, for minds, for futures, had just begun. The revelation came slowly, like water seeping into dry soil. Franz first sensed it during a lecture in the makeshift classroom. A low wooden hall hung with a faded American flag. The instructor, a tall lieutenant with patient eyes and a quiet authority, spoke fluent German. He did not shout or gloat. He simply described the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the idea that government might answer to the people rather than crush them. Franz sat in the second row, arms folded, fighting the reflex to dismiss every word. Yet the lieutenant's calm pierced where propaganda had once been steel. He talked of freedoms Americans took for granted. Speech, press, religion, not as boasts, but as facts. Behind Franz, someone scoffed. Another muttered about tricks. But a few leaned forward, curious despite themselves. Outside the classroom, the lessons were already living proof. The POW camps themselves were run with an almost bureaucratic fairness that startled men raised on fear. Geneva Convention posters hung in mess halls. Guards abided by them. Work was assigned but not brutal. Pay, small but real, came for honest labor. No one forced ideology at bayonet point. The beer, the library, the music nights. These were not indulgences, but part of a larger strategy. To win cooperation, to show a different kind of power. Franz only understood this after weeks of watching. The Americans needed hands. Their own young men were gone overseas or working war industries. Farms risked rotting crops. Sawmills lacked workers. Prisoners became the solution, but not if they were starving, rebellious, or broken. Feeding them well meant strong backs in the fields. Treating them humanely kept them docile. And something subtler unfolded. A belief, perhaps, that kindness might erode fanaticism faster than punishment ever could. One afternoon, while loading cotton bales under a low autumn sun, Franz worked beside a guard named Miller, a lanky Kansan with a slow drawl and an endless supply of gum. Miller, sweating through his shirt, leaned on his pitchfork and said in broken German, "Better to work and live, ja?" Then he offered Franz a stick of gum. Such a small gesture, sweet and minty, the first Franz had ever tasted. But it landed harder than a rifle butt. This man had every right to hate him, yet didn't. Franz chewed silently, bewildered. Not all prisoners welcomed the softness. Dieter, once proud of his Nazi party badge, warned that comfort was bait. "They want to make us weak," he whispered in the barracks. "Forget who we are." His tone was brittle, half-believing. But others answered with shrugs or weary eyes. "Maybe weakness is better than death," someone murmured. Franz said nothing, though a quiet agreement stirred in him. Weakness, he thought, or maybe just humanity. Letters from home sharpened the contrast. News of starvation, cities in ruins, families scraping to survive. One man read aloud that his wife traded heirlooms for bread. Another learned his brother had died in an Allied bombing. Franz read and reread his mother's cramped lines. "We have little coal, but I am alive." He felt guilt burn in his chest. Guilt for being fed, clothed, alive while his homeland suffered. But mingled with it came something else, a dawning sense that the Reich's promises had ended in rubble, while the enemy, astonishingly, offered dignity. the Americans were not saints. There were punishments for disobedience, solitary cells for brawlers, and clear reminders of defeat. But even discipline here lacked the cruelty Franz had expected. Guards scolded like strict teachers rather than tormentors. When a man collapsed from heat one day in the fields, medics rushed with water and shade instead of mockery. Each moment chipped another crack in the old armor of belief. Franz noticed a pattern. The more men saw fairness, the less they listened to hardliners. Nazis tried to hold evening study circles to reinforce ideology, but attendance dwindled. Work was tiring, kindness dulled rage. A library book or a soccer match did more damage to fanaticism than 100 Allied speeches. Even Dieter grew quieter. Once, after a long day picking oranges, he accepted a beer without protest and drank in brooding silence. The United States had practical reasons too. Officials worried about how returning POWs might shape post-war Germany, break them utterly, and resentment would fester. Treat them well, and maybe they'd return carrying seeds of democracy. Some officers called it re-education, though the word rarely passed the guards' lips. It wasn't lectures alone. It was a lived experience, a system where rules existed but did not crush, where victors could be firm yet fair. For Franz, the change was deeply personal. He had enlisted believing in strength as domination, in victory as the right to humiliate. Yet here he was, conquered and still treated as a man. It was disorienting, painful, and strangely hopeful. He remembered the first beer, the first laugh at a Mark Twain joke, the mint snap of gum in his mouth. Each small mercy was a wedge against hatred. He began to imagine a Germany rebuilt not on fear, but on something gentler. He did not yet dare say it aloud. One crisp evening, the lieutenant who taught democracy invited questions. The room was hushed. Few dared speak. Then a young prisoner near the back raised his hand. "Why?" he asked in careful German. "Why treat us well? We bombed your cities. We fought to destroy you." The lieutenant paused, weighing his words. "Because," he said softly, "we want you to see there is another way to live." His voice carried no triumph, only quiet conviction. War ends, people remain. Franz felt something shift inside him at those words, as if a door cracked open. He thought of his mother's face, of streets reduced to ash, of the Reich's promises collapsing under their own lies. Another way to live. Could it be that simple and that hard? Still, doubt lingered. Kindness could be a strategy, a weapon of influence. And perhaps that was the point. If mercy could dismantle hate, was it any less powerful than bullets? Franz wrestled with this as the camp lights blinked out each night. He was no longer certain who the enemy truly was, or what he himself might become when the gates finally opened. Weeks later, a rumor swept the camp. New programs were coming. Films, debates, even vocational training for life after release. Some whispered about job offers, sponsorships, the chance to start fresh in America. Others scoffed, unwilling to believe in generosity. Franz felt torn. Hope stirring, but tangled with suspicion. That night, under a vast Texas sky, he sat on the barrack step, sipping a rationed beer. Stars burned cold and clear. Miller the guard passed by, tipped his cap, and kept walking without a word. Franz watched him go, the silence somehow heavier than speech. The war had taught him to fear enemies. This captivity was teaching him something more unsettling. Enemies could choose to be human, and somewhere beyond the barbed wire, unseen by men like him, plans were already being laid for the next phase, one that would challenge every belief he still clung to and demand a choice he had never imagined making. The war had ended long before the gates finally opened, yet stepping through them felt like crossing into another lifetime. Franz walked with a small pack slung over one shoulder, the Texas sun behind him and a sea-gray Atlantic waiting ahead. His body was lean but strong from months of work. His mind was heavier. Around him, men murmured goodbyes to guards who had once been strangers and now felt oddly familiar. Some shook hands, some could not. Franz found Miller in the crowd, the lanky guard with the easy smile, and managed a quiet "Danke." Miller only tipped his cap and said, "Good luck, pal," in his slow drawl. It was a farewell without ceremony, but it lodged in Franz's chest like a stone. The ship eastward was crowded with silence. Men stood at the rail, staring at endless water, each wrapped in private reckoning. Dieter sat nearby, his once iron posture slumped. He smoked with a tremor in his hand, eyes fixed on nothing. "We lost more than a war," he said at last, his voice thin. Franz didn't answer. He knew Dieter was not asking for one. For days, Franz thought of the camp, the music, the books, the gentle discipline. He thought of his first beer, the cold bottle in a trembling hand. He feared what waited on the other side of the ocean: rubble, hunger, and the old ghosts of ideology. Germany appeared first as a faint coastline, then a wounded land. The port was a ruin of twisted cranes and hollow warehouses. Streets leading inland were pocked with bomb craters, walls painted with soot. Franz walked among families wearing faces of wary welcome. His mother's house stood but barely, windows patched with cardboard, her body smaller than memory. She clutched him tight and wept, half from relief, half from the sight of him. Alive, but changed. That night, over thin broth, she asked what America had been. He hesitated, searching for words. How to explain mercy from the enemy without sounding like betrayal? At last he said only, "They treated us like men." She studied him long, then nodded once, tears glinting. In the months that followed, Franz faced a Germany trying to rebuild from ash and shame. Former soldiers gathered in corners, muttering of lost honor. New political voices promised order, revenge, pride. But Franz had seen another kind of strength: quiet, patient, unafraid of kindness. He found work helping clear debris from Hamburg's ruined streets. The labor was hard but honest, and when a U.S. relief convoy passed, he stepped forward to translate for an older woman. The American driver blinked in surprise, then smiled. It felt strange and freeing to stand between worlds. Dieter did not adapt so easily. He lingered in bitterness, drinking when he could, railing against a future he no longer trusted. Once, in a bar's dim light, he snarled that the Americans had poisoned them with comfort. Franz looked at him, this man who had once spoken of destiny, and said softly, "Maybe comfort was what saved us." Dieter laughed, harsh and hollow, but did not argue. The seed planted in the camp took root in quiet ways. Franz attended new civic meetings arranged under Allied oversight. He listened as officials spoke of democracy, of rebuilding without fear. He was skeptical but also curious, a man who had tasted another way to live. When elections came, he stood in line to vote, something unimaginable to the boy who had once marched off to Hitler's war. He thought of the lieutenant's voice. War ends. People remain, yet the past clung like smoke. One evening, while clearing rubble near a half-collapsed church, Franz found himself approached by a young neighbor whispering about joining a secret nationalist circle. "We can't let them humiliate us forever," the man urged. Franz studied him, the anger, the hunger, and felt the tug of old pride. But then memory rose. Miller's quiet kindness, a cold beer on a burning day, the patient lectures about a freer life. He shook his head. "Humiliation isn't the same as learning," he said simply, and walked away. The man shouted after him, but Franz kept moving, heart pounding with something like defiance. But this time, defiance against hate. Years later, when visitors asked what captivity had been, Franz would struggle. It wasn't comfort, exactly. It was confrontation. Not with brutality, but with humanity that made hatred harder to carry. He would say the Americans won his body in battle, but his anger they stole with decency. The lesson was simple and shattering. Strength need not be cruelty. He thought of it most on quiet nights, when Germany slowly stitched itself back together, and new friendships with the West flickered to life. Factories reopened, cities rebuilt, and men like him, former enemies, began writing letters to the guards who had once watched them. Franz sent one to Miller, unsure if it would reach. Months later, an envelope arrived, a short note in uneven German wishing him peace. He held it like a relic. Standing one evening by the Elbe, the river dark under a pale moon, Franz felt the weight of years and choices. The world could have crushed him with revenge and perhaps forged another enemy. Instead, it had handed him bread, books, and a cold drink in the heat. Mercy had done what bullets never could. It had changed him. And yet, mercy was not weakness. It was deliberate, disciplined, and powerful. A quiet force that had shaped his future more than fear ever had. He looked toward the west, where ships still crossed the sea, and wondered how many lives had turned on such small acts. A fair word, a bottle of beer, a guard's simple kindness. Far beyond the river, the world was stirring again with new tensions, new wars. But Franz knew now what he had not as a young soldier: that cruelty breeds only more cruelty, while respect, even for the defeated, can break a cycle no weapon ever will. He breathed the night air, heavy with coal smoke and hope, and felt certain of one thing. The Americans had won more than the war. They had won a quiet, enduring victory in the hearts of men like him. And somewhere, in the memory of a single cold beer behind barbed wire, the first fragile peace had already begun.